you. You've been on our program earlier too, and I think other than Professor Benjamin Friedman from Harvard, you are the only one who's come second time on our program. So I must thank you for accepting our invite and being here. So, as we all know, that Professor Nirvikar is from University of California, Santa Cruz, and he has agreed to come and speak to us on this important topic. As you know, that EGROW Foundation, a research-based think tank in NCR, has been running this webinar series since COVID, and we have been very fortunate to have a blend of practitioners, academicians, scholars, and researchers speak to us on various issues. It is in this context we have had the privilege of having two Nobel laureates also come and speak to us. As you would have noticed, the world is changing rapidly. India is on the brink of the union budget. And this budget is important for us because we are going to be in election mode in 2024. So we may have one interim budget, and then we may have a budget for about 6 months or 9 months later. We thought that before we get into the budget, we wanted to discuss and look at globalization. We have had two lectures. One is scheduled today and one we did last week. We are looking at how globalization is going to impact us. And as a policy think tank, we wanted that this factors in, given the global situation that is prevailing now, given the slowdown that has happened in the rest of the world, given the fact that 2023 may be worse than 2022 and some countries may get into a recession, given the aggressive interest rate cycle which America has followed chasing inflation, all these issues that have been there, who can tell us the best? So that is why we had requested Professor Kulkarni, who spoke to us last Friday, and Professor Nirvikar, who is going to share his thoughts with us today. With this brief introduction, I would now like to invite Professor Nirvikar to share his thoughts about globalization and India. Professor Nirvikar, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charan Singh. It's a pleasure to be speaking to all of you. It gave me a chance to collect my thoughts on this topic. I've prepared a very non-technical presentation. I tend to actually minimize numbers and charts, and in this case, I have none. And yet I want to share some general ideas with you that I hope will be not completely familiar to all of you. So I'm going to share my screen and start a presentation. Let's see. So I hope the screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, great. I just want to, okay. So, so the title of my talk today is Globalization, Where is it headed and what will that mean for India? I hope it's relevant for the budget as well, but maybe it's a little broader than just a single budget. So, okay. So here's an outline of the talk. I want to try to answer these questions. What is globalization? What is good about it? What are the concerns about it? What are the underlying trends? How will they affect India? And what can or should India do? And then I'll conclude. So my hope is that when I'm done going through these slides and trying to answer these questions, that you'll have maybe a little deeper, a broader framework for thinking about these issues. And of course, these are very much in the news and everybody has opinions, so I'll add mine to those. So what is globalization? Very simply, of course, it's the increased movement across national borders of goods and services, and that, of course, we tend to focus on a lot, trade in goods and services. And we also focus a lot on the movement across national borders of money and financial capital. And I put the two slightly differently because financial capital is, I'm thinking of for investment purposes, and money can simply be transfers, remittances, foreign aid, and so on. What we tend not to maybe focus on as much when we talk about globalization, though we talk about these things in different contexts, is the movement across national borders of people and of knowledge. And I think those two are an important part of this whole collection of things that make up globalization. So we'll come to that. So what's good about globalization? I think the economic case for globalization goes back over a century and a half, almost 2 centuries. Go back to David Ricardo's work on comparative advantage. We get allocation efficiency gains from specializing production and then trading according to comparative advantage. And this I think, one of the most non-obvious and brilliant ideas that comes out of economic reasoning. Much more recently, we've also developed the idea that there can also be efficiency gains from specializing production when there are increasing returns in production. Right? When you have economies of scale, that's not something in the standard Ricardian model, but it's something that was developed a few decades ago, and of course it's an important part of trade in goods and services. There's also allocation efficiency gains from allocating people and financial capital across borders. Again, some of it is just simply being able to combine the different inputs or factors of production in ways that are going to yield more output. If during the Y2K problem, American firms were importing IT professionals from India to help them fix it, that would be an example of allocating people for efficiency gains. Slightly differently from all of these are the productivity gains from the spread of knowledge, because of it being a non-rival. Knowledge is a non-rival good. If I use some blueprints to build a new machine, that doesn't mean that that blueprint is not available to somebody else. And of course, it may be that the other person can be prevented from using that knowledge through legal means. So the knowledge may be exclusive, but it's non-rival in the sense that it's not used up once you apply it. And of course, this idea was developed very effectively by Paul Romer, and became actually the basis for theories of endogenous growth. So in this slide, actually, I've just talked about allocation efficiency, but of course, an important potential corollary of all of this is the impacts on growth. And many of the other reasons for the benefits of globalization have to do with static efficiency gains. But the use of knowledge in particular is something that allows long run of sustainable growth, continued growth, let's say, because sustainable now tends to be something else. Okay, so this is something that we mostly are familiar with. I just wanted to review these ideas for you. What are the concerns about globalization? So here we start to move outside pure economics in the sense of technical economics, but certainly economics has a long tradition of thinking about inequality, and in Indian policy debates, of course, there's been this idea of inclusive growth and so on. So inequality is something that is important, and I think in the context of globalization, I would say empirically, the issue has been inequality within countries rather than across countries, because I think it's broadly true that globalization has narrowed the gap between the rich and the poor to the extent that the poor are also able to, to sell goods and services or send people to richer countries. But within countries, what we have been observing, I think, is that the gains from globalization are disproportionately captured by the richer people in both in advanced countries and in less advanced countries, developing countries. So within countries, globalization contributes to inequality, I think, and that is a problem. And of course, it's not just an abstract problem. It contributes to social disruption. There are impacts on groups and communities, and this is particularly salient in richer countries because I think the expectations of the expectations are higher, and the effect of fall in relative living standards is much greater. And by groups here, I mean the communities. Obviously, I'm thinking of geographic entities, but groups, are especially categories of workers, right? So textile workers in the U.S. or lots of other examples like that. And the third concern about globalization is volatility and instability. And of course, this is particularly associated with the mobility of capital, financial capital that can move in and out very quickly of a location, so portfolio investment or similar kinds of investment. So that's the volatility aspect, instability, and that of course potentially contributes to instability in countries where capital moves in and out very rapidly. And what we also discovered during the pandemic is that part of what we've seen with globalization, specialization, and concentration is vulnerable to events like natural disasters, earthquakes, wars, and in the most recent case, the COVID pandemic. Okay, so this is again, I'm just reviewing, trying to systematically review everything that we know about globalization. So, what are the underlying trends? The world keeps changing. It's economic models are abstract. We try to abstract from the particulars as much as possible, but there are changes that reflect one way movements, and perhaps the most important example of that is automation. Right? And of course, we've seen that before. The Industrial Revolution was completely based on replacing human power or animal power with machines. And what we're seeing now, of course, is something that is in some sense deeper. The way it's been put is that the Industrial Revolution saw muscle power being replaced by machines, and now what we're seeing is brain power being replaced by machines. In any case, what this is contributing to is diminishing returns to specialization of labor-intensive manufacturing, which has been one of the bedrocks of the globalization that we've seen in the post-World War II era. And I think another component of this phenomenon, this trend, is demographics and limits to consumption in rich countries. There's only so many things that people can buy, and to some extent, one could argue that the the dynamics of capitalism is based on convincing people that they need to keep replacing goods, and I think that also has its limits. In any case, the other underlying trends, some of them are obviously related very closely to the concerns that I talked about in the previous slide, but specifically populism and nationalism in rich countries is very much on the rise. I think it's being driven by inequality and disruption of communities and so on. That's a pretty easy statement to make. And we're also seeing, I think, the challenges of war and disease, and it's hard to say how much of a trend this is. I think it's really just, in some sense, a return to normal from the perspective of human history. There was a period, in the recent past where we thought, okay, we've got global peace and we've got everything under control, and diseases are being wiped out. And what we've seen in the last few years, in particular, is that war and disease are still around and not going away anytime soon. I think a very important underlying trend is China's assertiveness, and we can talk a little bit more about that later on, perhaps. But I'm calling out China simply because it is a rising power, and it is one of the two most populous countries in the world. I think it's inevitable that we're going to keep looking at India and China in the context of globalization. There's also a trend which is which represents the end of an era of about, I guess, 15 years, super low interest rates, and that I think is something that also is going to have to be factored in as we go forward. So I want to share with you some different perspectives on globalization. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just to show you how people are thinking about these kinds of issues. So this is actually, sorry, I didn't note the year. This is from several years ago, a book, The Globalization Paradox, Democracy and the Future of the World Economy, by Danny Roderick, who's a very prominent and very influential economist at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And these quotes are actually not directly from him, but they are blurbs for his book. So the first one says, Danny Roderick offers a new narrative, one that embraces an ineluctable tension. We cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, national self-determination, and economic globalization. And so probably, having written this several years ago, Roderick is probably now saying, I told you so. And yet I'm not convinced that he's completely right, that we cannot simultaneously achieve these different goals. So, but that's something that we can explore together. And then the other idea that Danny Roderick has been very vocal about is this idea of premature deindustrialization. And this is very much empirically based, where he has done some cross-country regressions and says that countries are running out of industrialization opportunities sooner and at much lower levels of income compared to the experience of early industrializers. And one can't argue with data, but the issue here always is, is past performance an indicator of future results? And that's the area where I'm going to maybe raise some questions about this idea of premature deindustrialization as an inevitable trend for the short run or medium run future. So another academic economist, very influential, and you might not have heard of Danny Roderick, but you've all heard of Raghuram Rajan. And I think this was 2018, he wrote a book, The Third Pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind. So he He talks about the rapid progress of economic globalization spurred by trade and technological change. And he argues that national governments have scaled up accordingly to deal with globalization, but that has left communities behind. And he argues for the need to strengthen local communities. So this is, I guess, a social capital argument, and also just a pure economic argument that if communities decay, then you're losing a lot of not just social capital but also infrastructure. If you look at many American cities in areas that were part of the Rust Belt or part of the old industrial economy in the U.S., there's been significant decay in infrastructure. It takes a lot of investment and work to reverse those trends. I think there's a little bit of a kind of developed country bias in Rajan's analysis, and I think there are also some paradoxes which I will come to. The most recent book that I want to use to illustrate some of the how people are thinking about these things is not by an academic economist, but by a very prominent journalist. I don't know how well known she is in India, but she comes in the US. She comes on CNN all the time, and she's a business columnist for the Financial Times. So she obviously has a very significant platform. Her book is Homecoming: The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World, and the quotes that I'm giving here are actually from the early part of her book, I think the introduction. And to me, they are actually really, really kind of jarring. So the first one: far from making us all free, the free market changed us from citizens into consumers, increasingly beholden to the increasingly large companies that outsourced our jobs and mined our personal data. And her second quote is: two groups prospered disproportionately under American-style neoliberalism, multinational companies and the Chinese. So to me, this really illustrates a very specific angle with which Foroohar is kind of viewing globalization. And this view is actually shared by a lot of people. Foroohar is a business columnist, but if I talk to my colleagues in the humanities, history, anthropology, sociology, they very much would share this kind of view. And with the first quote, I'm sure there's a lot of, there's a very strong tradition in India too, right? If you think back to Gandhian ideas, I think he would have also been very, very much in line with some of this thinking. In any case, I thought these three illustrations would give you a feel of what is a very prominent perspective on globalization. All three of these are different, but they do have some overlaps as well. So what I want to do in this talk is to raise some alternative views to what I think Roderick and Rajan and Foroohar are postulating. And I think one very important point I want to make is that industrialization is not the same. Even though in the abstract, industrialization is making labor more productive by creating newer machines and better machines, and taking advantage of economies of scale and all that. So those abstract ideas don't change, but industrialization keeps changing in character. In particular, I think digital technology is just beginning to have its long-run impacts on how economies are structured and organized, and that has a long way to go. And you could argue, well, that globalization is kind of making that already challenging process worse. But on the other hand, I think it's not it's kind of unfair to blame globalization for technological progress. And I use the word progress because I think ultimately it is harnessing of technology which leads to our having more fruitful lives. Let me say, allows humans to flourish. And it's not apparent in many cases, which has to do, I think, in particular with climate change, right? So that's what we're dealing with now, is the fact that markets have limits in terms of dealing with certain kinds of situations, public goods and externalities, and there's nothing more illustrative of that than global warming. And of course, I think we have to recognize that given where we are, the solutions are going to come from technology and innovation. I think another thing that we have to take account of is that while in many ways the demographics of richer countries are putting limits on industrialization and global trade of goods and services, they are also going to create new demand patterns. Aging populations have very different needs than younger populations, and we're already seeing that very, very rapidly in richer countries in terms of how economies are organized, what goods and services are needed, and so on. And of course, this is all means that we have a lot of flux, and so it's a very challenging time for the world. But I don't think shutting up shop and kind of becoming insular is going to be a solution, as I will argue. In terms of what Farohar and Rajan write, I think also I want to point out there's a little bit of a mismatch between the nostalgia for homecoming and local communities and what Farohar and Rajan argue. They're of course good liberals or good caring people, and they want to they want to support immigration, that people should be allowed to migrate for good reasons. But what you can see is, of course, is that the same nostalgia for the same drivers of homecoming and autarky and insularity also are aligned with pressures to restrict immigration. And in fact, immigration, I'm sorry, it's not the pressures to restrict immigration which reinvigorate communities, but the immigration itself. So sorry, that sentence is not so clear. So what I'm arguing is that I think there's a kind of a disconnect between kind of desires to restrict globalization of in terms of movement of goods and services and money, and allowing the free flow of people. In fact, if you think about the disruptions of globalization, they to the extent that you can have flows of goods and services, you're less likely, I think, to create disruptions through the movement of people. And of course, it depends on the skill level and so on, and the reasons. So there's a lot of complications there. So how will the trends affect India? I think irrespective of any homecoming, global and regional production networks are going to be restructured. That's what the way the world economy is organized, and the only issue is going to be, what are the detailed locations for those production networks. And I think the changes in demand patterns and production technologies are also going to be very important for India going forward. It's it may be that the way that certain goods are produced is going to change. Maybe it will become capital intensive, but I think there will be additional opportunities for new types of goods and services, and I think also to some extent digitization in some cases can uh, reduce the influence of economies of scale. You can produce at lower efficiently at lower scale using information technology. Um, so I think the trend, the end of the low interest rate era is going to be important because the competition for global capital will be more intense, and that certainly
वो
will be
ईग्रा वाला
challenge for
है
India.
ना.
And I think uh, immigration is going to have restrictions. So we saw again, from the 60s through recent years, there was a lot of demand for unskilled, semi-skilled, and then skilled labor in richer countries, and I think there will be some brakes put on that, and that all of that has to be factored into India's strategy. And going back to one of my earlier theoretical points, I think scientific and technological knowledge and know-how will be more valuable. We're again at an inflection point in terms of the use of technology to organize our economies, and the value of I think these kinds of know-how will continue to increase. And so I think here that there's no I think worry about diminishing returns. Okay, so what can or should India do? I think this is something that everybody understands. Recently, the finance minister of India, talked about skilling to scale, and I was applauding that. India has to make education, training, and skilling a priority, and of course, this is an area where India has done very poorly. So I don't know exactly how to do this. But it really needs a lot of attention. And then there's the obvious need to build physical infrastructure to facilitate stronger positions in new production networks. Again, India has been kind of dipping its toe in the water for decades, but it needs to do it much more forcefully and with more focus. I think here, the rise of China and this idea of friendshoring is an important one. Not because it means that you have to align exactly with U.S. strategic interests, but I think given those strategic interests, India can leverage this desire for friendshoring strategically for its own benefit. And of course, much of the economic development, the miracle growth of East Asia was tied to U.S. strategic interests. And again, I think you have to strategize based on new demand patterns and innovations in goods and production techniques. So this requires taking a long-run view of how things are changing. And my favorite example has always been the case of the Japanese. And one can argue a lot about the details, but I think it's accurate to say that the Japanese bureaucrats and politicians back in 1950 said, okay, we're going to develop an automobile industry because automobiles are going to have a high income elasticity of demand. And if we can make automobiles, we can make lots of other things because they're the most complex good around in terms of engineering requirements and so on. And it took the Japanese more than 2 decades and a lot of luck. The oil crisis helped them, but certainly they became so the Japanese auto industry became so successful that the U.S. kind of took anti-globalization measures even then. I don't know if you remember the voluntary export restraints from the 1980s. Again, just looking at these long-run trends, I think India really has to rapidly build its own digital infrastructure. And the two areas, which are going to be very important are information technology and life sciences. And India really has to, I think, look for leadership in some of these areas. Not everything, of course, but there are always going to be parts of these two sectors. And then I think India has to invest heavily in the green transition, not just for the welfare of its own citizens, but because this is going to be important globally. So anything that is tied to the global green transition is going to be a good investment. And I think that's really, I think, a very important point, that if we're dealing with global warming and climate change, that is inherently a global problem, and it will require global solutions. And so globalization is not going away. And I don't think globalization is going to slow down that much. It will change in character. And the changes in character are going to be based on technological change and political and strategic concerns. But in some sense, the underlying driver of everything is the need to save the world from complete catastrophe. So this is not easy. I think in a democracy, autocrats sometimes do things that are really stupid. If you think of Mao Zedong's China, but then they're also able to move very strategically and quickly. So I think in a democracy it's a little harder, but I think it's possible, and India's leaders have to display strategic vision and intent. And I think India has an opportunity to be a leader in global coordination of climate policies, global coordination of corporate taxes, which is a very important issue for many countries, not just developing countries. So rather than individual tax terrorism, arbitrary retrospective taxes, India should be working as part of a global system. Similarly, coordination of intellectual property rights and competition policies. Farouhar complains about multinationals, but that's a global problem, and it has to be solved through I think global coordination of antitrust and so on. You see this in the European Union, where you have more than 24 countries have created a framework for coordination through the European Union. And I think one of the stupidest things we've seen by policymakers, for example, was Brexit, and it's going to harm the UK for a long time. So I think those kind of impulses are really damaging, both for individual countries and globally. So I think there's a real opportunity here for India to become a global leader. Thank you. So now I will stop sharing and happy to take questions.
Professor Nirvikar, really thanks for giving us this big framework that you have shared with us. Very interesting, and giving us this clear picture of what you think. My question is more mundane and to the ground. And I'm thinking of what's happening in the global situation now with the interest rates following that cycle. You've been a keen observer of India, and you've written extensively on India, and you have done lots of work on India fiscal policy and even the state's fiscal policy. So my question to you was that, do you think India will be able to decouple from the slowdown that is expected in the rest of the world? And what can be the policies that the government can pursue somehow? Some of those you have mentioned too in your conclusion, digitalization and all that. But I was wondering, is there anything that the government can do, a fiscal policy or a tax policy or an expenditure policy, to somehow let these difficult winds, spillovers come to India?
Yeah, no, that's a very tough one, and it's tough in every country, right? Because every country has spent a lot on dealing with the pandemic, so there's less room to maneuver. From my perspective, I think there are certain kinds of investments that have high payoffs, high rates of return, and certain kinds of infrastructure. So I'm a big fan of investment in digital infrastructure, because when I look at digital infrastructure or experience digital infrastructure in India, I think it's probably where the US was 10, 20 years ago, and even further. I mean, some advanced countries have even better digital infrastructure than the US. So I think just providing a very extensive and low-cost digital infrastructure really creates opportunities for people to figure out ways to to survive and sometimes thrive. Sometimes it just means enabling small businesses to reach new customers. It can reduce costs of transportation and so on, right? I mean, I think in terms of those kind of efficiencies, the rate of return to digital infrastructure, I would say, is very high. And I feel like that's something that hasn't been implemented as effectively as it might have been. Again, I think other kinds of infrastructure too, India has been underinvesting. It's always a little tricky, right? Because we saw that in the last construction and infrastructure boom, a lot of money was wasted and stolen, right? So that's always difficult. From the point of view of the budget, I think there is room for strategic tax incentives. And again, my experience compared with India is mostly from the US, but the US often drives innovation with tax incentives, right? And it doesn't have to be particular industries. It could be for particular categories like startups, certain kinds of startups, or all kinds of all startups and so on. So Silicon Valley has benefited greatly from the way that the tax system works in terms of taxation of stock options and so on, right? It really promotes risk taking. So I think there are things there where there could be some improvements in the structure of taxation. And I would say also, I think tariffs in general are not a good idea, because you might get a little bit of protection here and there, and you might get a little bit of revenue here and there, but often they have unintended consequences. So I think the sort of inherent kind of bias in India towards, okay, let's use tariffs to achieve our goals, I think it can be problematic, I think. So I don't know if any of those ideas are pertinent or useful, but let me stop there, and maybe I'll come up with something else.
Yeah, Professor, there are a couple of questions for you in the chat box, and I leave it to you which one you want to choose and answer. In the meantime, in case there are anyone who wants to directly ask a question, most welcome. Ashok, I'll first ask Professor Ashok Vishandas, and then we will go to Dr. Matthew Kurian. Dr. Vishandas. Dr. Vishandas is my colleague on the board of the EGROW Foundation, and he's a professor at IITA. Before that, he was the chairman of CSCP, the one government body, which fixes the agriculture prices in the country.
Okay.
Dr. Ashok Vishandas. Okay, then let's go on to Dr. Kurian, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nirvikar Singh, for the excellent and lucid presentation of a topic which has multiple dimensions. I have 3 points as queries to you. One is, how do you read the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, the Great Recession? Was it an end of, was it a definite constraint to globalization process? That is one of my questions. The second question is, we know that United States of America was very excited in initiating globalization. But when we come to the time of President Trump onwards, we find they have shifted the policy towards, I would say, that neo-mercantilism, with a trade war, technology war, and the like. This is my second question. And the third one on India. That is, in spite of our political problem with China, the trade deficit between India and China, that is consistently changing in favor of China. So how to explain this so controversial type of a trend? I think you could follow. I know the limitation of the time. That is why I have raised these three points.
Yeah.
I'm extremely indebted to you all for giving this opportunity. I am Matthew Guren from Kerala, Mahatma Gandhi University. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, thank you, Dr. Kurian. I'm familiar with your work also, so the global financial crisis. It's interesting because Dr. Rakesh Mohan would always call it the North American financial crisis, and I think that was a very good point, because it was really something that was created in the U.S. and spread from the U.S. And it really reflected policy failures, which I think were the way I like to think of it is that there was a mismatch between technological innovation in terms of financial products and the institutions that were allowing those financial products to be traded and so on. And I think it was a very expensive lesson, very costly. In some ways, I think this is an ongoing issue again with technological change. You're seeing it, for example, in crypto, right, where the collapse of FTX has some of the same flavor, where and you could argue that it's not kind of it's just that regulators have a hard time keeping up with people who are going to cheat and misuse and abuse the system. But then on the other hand, that's some of the cost of doing business, right? If you want innovation, you got to kind of expect some of that. You just got to keep an eye on it, right? And even in a supposedly conservative banking system like India's, you have in finance, you have some very prominent cases of people just stealing money. So I think that finance is just susceptible to that. So your second point about neo-mercantilism, that I think is a problem, right? And I think Trump and to some extent Biden, this is going to be a problem because, as I said, that workers in which countries are upset about globalization, they're blaming globalization for their problems. Yeah, I mean, you saw that in the 1980s with the Japanese auto industry too. And there's always this ongoing tension. Again, some of it I think has to do with domestic policy failures, right? If the U.S. weren't so bad at kind of looking after people at the bottom of the income distribution, then weren't so bad at enabling transitions, I think you wouldn't have that kind of problem. And this is an old idea that trade restrictions are second best or third best solution to the underlying problems. I'm sorry, what was the third point you sorry, Dr. Kurian, what was your third question?
The growing trade gap between India
Oh,
and
right,
China.
right. Yeah. So I guess I tend to be a little bit, you know, less worried about these kind of things because, again, the nature of international trade is that you have deficits somewhere and surpluses elsewhere. So I think the point is not so much the size of the deficit, if that's based on comparative advantage, but I do think I share concerns with U.S. policymakers about theft of intellectual property and anti-competitive moves and so on. And of course, the U.S. sometimes misuses those concerns as well. But I think there are strategic reasons for limiting certain kinds of trade. But if China makes good cheap toys for Indian children, I think that's less of a problem. Again, I think the solution is to make Indian industry more competitive, rather than worry specifically about China or anything. So anyway, it's complicated, right? Because there are always distributional impacts too, and so on, yeah, and long run impacts. So.
Thank you very much.
Would you like to take some of the questions which are in the chat box?
Yeah, so I'll open the chat box again.
Yeah, so one question, which is the last one, I thought was interesting. A couple of questions on climate and globalization, but this one I thought was very good, and I think comes from your North America global financial crisis story. Now, the global South sensitive model of globalization is becoming stronger by the day. How does India stands for a shift from self-centered globalization to human-centered?
I don't know how to answer that question. Individuals are self-interested to a large degree, and countries also, to the extent that they're democratic, act in the interests of their citizens. So the challenge is really how do we then solve a problem which involves externalities and the global public good of containing global warming. So it's I think a religious leader and maybe even some political leaders would kind of try to be inspirational and say, we just need to be better people. But economists say that, okay, you got to have mechanisms that reward behavior that is it's Pareto improving, and this sort of modeling of the commons problem as a prisoner's dilemma is a very old and powerful idea. And then how do you change the structure of the game, right? And I think part of the answer for India in particular is that a lot of things that India needs to do are in the long run interests of India's people, irrespective of what other countries do. So yeah, India has not been a major contributor to the problem, but it can't just kind of sit back and say, okay, well, we're the victims and we're just going to keep suffering. I think one thing that is very important, which maybe I will emphasize, is that countries that have the capital need to transfer it and invest it in the global South, right? If India needs 1% of GDP to have enough to invest to deal with its the damage it's going to face from global warming, then it's not going to be able to raise all that money domestically. So there's been a real kind of under commitment, and part of the problem again is that I think the fossil fuel industry in countries like the US is very powerful. It keeps kind of undermining these kind of agreements. So there's a political economy problem in the global north. I think the COVID pandemic and the need to spend money, devote fiscal resources there, really took away from what is needed here. I think that I would like to see multilateral institutions stepping up more because what could be a bigger problem than a global catastrophe? And if the World Bank and the IMF are not making this a #1 priority, they're not doing their jobs. And again, they should be raising more capital. They should be focusing transfers and investment in this direction. And then I think national governments and the private sector can be complementary. So I think the multilateral institutions could play a much bigger role in global leadership there. And I don't know about forums like G20 and so on. Maybe that's also an area where one can hammer out these kind of deals. So I mean, you need money to solve the problem, right? And the money is not in the global south. It's in sitting in New York and London and places like that.
True, Professor Nirvikar. It's money which makes the mayor go. And I had a chance to interact with some economists who were working at BIS, Bank for International Settlement. And I told them, look, you keep doing research on advanced countries, they don't need it. They already know enough about themselves. You do no research on emerging countries, they don't know anything about themselves. And the advanced countries do not know anything about the emerging countries. So your research is skewed and is being done or overdone in places where it is not needed. And they told me, Charan, it is a simple rule. You don't have the money, you can't engage us, employ us, or reward us. And they are the ones who can do anything. So why should we do it for you? So I totally agree with that, with your observation, Professor. We'll take one more question, the last one from Professor Bezbarua.
Yes, thank you for looking at me. So, Professor, it's a very illuminating talk, and it was very educative for me. And your emphasis on education for India to stay, as a global leader is very well taken. Now, my question is, in India, now we are, we are grappling with implementation of a new, national education policy, which was framed very recently. Do you sort of see that this policy, this new policy, education policy, have priorities right in the kind of education you want India to pursue? So this is something I'd appreciate your opinion on that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'll give my opinion as a non-expert in this area, education policy, but clearly there are a lot of very good things in the national education policy. In particular, I think, let me just put it very briefly, I think a lot more flexibility and a lot more attention to what learning actually is, beyond just passing exams and getting certificates. So I think that's all very good. I think one of the major I think constraints on the provision of education in India is insufficient competition and investment. And I know that it makes people worried when one has the private sector being significant in education, and you can have problems with that. I mean, I've seen that in the US, right, where private for-profit education providers often exploit students. But I think, again, that's one of the things that you have to deal with through something like regulation, a certain kind of regulation, not by putting a lot of detailed restrictions on, well, you have to have so I mean, India has been regulating private sector education, for example, at the primary level in certain ways that I think raise the cost for private providers. So I would say, especially at the university level, that allowing a free hand to foreign partnerships. If you look at the demographics in many advanced countries, they're not favorable to the education sector, right? So my university is desperately seeking students from China and India, bringing them here to educate them. It would be much cheaper to educate Indian students in India. So if my university, were allowed to freely, operate in India, I think that would be much more efficient. And I mean, there's some benefits of experience, being abroad and so on, but not everybody can do that. So you could really expand the reach of education through I think more foreign investment, and that what you get there is actually a wonderful bundle of money and expertise and knowledge, right? So it's a kind of FDI that I think I would much rather have FDI in education than FDI in retail. Just to give you an example, right? I think that the payoff for India would be much higher.
Thank you very much. Very instructive kind of answer.
And as Nirvikar says, this is his unskilled, unprepared, unprofessional answer. Thank you, Nirvikar. That's really good. I really like that. That's a great idea. FDI in education can be far more rewarding than FDI in retail. I think that's a very good idea. Okay, so this comes to an end. We have had an excellent 1 hour of discussion with Professor Nirvikar on globalization and what India can do. And I get two things out of it. One is your last statement. We need to invest in education and skilling, and whatever needs to be done should be done. Getting foreign universities into India is a great idea. And of course, the other one, which I thought is very good, is the multinational institutions have to swing into action and also do something. They can't be just mute spectators to the whole thing, which is playing out over and over again, with North America always leading and doing devastating harm whenever a crisis takes place. And it's happened, Lehman's happened, now it is happening. So I think the world has to sit up and say something is wrong. Something is wrong with the policymakers there. Something is wrong with their central bank or with their fiscal policy. And the economists who are working in those countries on these issues. Probably they don't have the right solutions for the world. They're too self centered. And because of that, EMEs are suffering from severe spillovers. So I think the multinational institutions will have to play a more prominent role. So with this, Professor Nirvikar, I want to profusely thank you for accepting our invite and talking to us. I know it's pretty early morning up there in California, but you were kind enough to accept and allow us this time slot. I also want to thank the participants in this webinar who have enriched our discussion through the chat, many observations on the chat box, as well as asking questions. We will have this interaction available on our website tomorrow by noon, and we would welcome you to share this with your students or others. This talk specifically of today has policy implications, and therefore, if you are one of the policymakers in your country, whichever country, you will probably benefit from sharing this with the policymakers or researchers. Next week, we are continuing with our journey on fiscal policy. On 27th, we have a discussion with Professor Pinaki, who will be speaking to us in terms of the fiscal policy, that how to interpret it, what does it mean, and what can the fiscal policy do, and why is it so relevant for us in the present context. Just to tell you in a nutshell, next year is the election year, the general election. So this budget of 2023 is going to be sort of a vision for 2 years. Next year, we may get an interim budget in February, and then we'll get a partial budget sometimes in May or June or July. So this budget is a very important budget expected on February 1 in 2023. and we are all looking forward to the major policy decisions, this will almost go 2 years. So Professor Pinaki from National Institute of Public Finance and Policy will be talking, and there'll be another discussant, and we'll have a good discussion on the fiscal policy. On February 1, the day of the budget, we'll be discussing something about economic survey, which would have been released on January 31, and the union budget, which would have been released in the morning of February 1. So I'm requesting all of you for an enlightened discussion on the union budget. Do tune in with us by about 5 o'clock, and before Arnab Goswami and others flash and brainwash you with their information. So we economists are making an attempt to sit and talk about the union budget in a more professional way. 5 p.m. on February 1. February 3 again, we'll have another budget discussion, and that will be 2 days later when data has seeped in. We talk about what the union budget is all about and how we think it will play out in the year ahead. So with this, we have a very action-oriented week next week from 27th onwards. We would welcome you to come and join us in that. The timings of these discussions will be, of course, back to the traditional EGROW timing hours, which are generally 60 minutes and generally between 4 to 5. So we'll go back to that. Once again, thanking Professor Nirvikar and all of you for this late night discussion that we have had today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.